Welcome to this second podcast on what is evangelicalism. We had an earlier one late last year, which we focused on the definition of evangelicalism. Today, our plan is to dive a little deeper, but I'll just set a little context for this conversation. We have several panelists with us, and I will let them kind of introduce themselves as they speak rather than taking a lot of time to do that as we start. But just to remind you, we started off with the definition from David Bebbington, which is a classic definition of evangelicalism, which involves conversionism, that personal relationship with Christ, activism, our lived out faith and the need to share Christ, biblicism, the focus on the Bible as the central place for guidance in spiritual affairs, and crucicentrism, the cross and Jesus's death for sin being central. And we raised the question about whether there needs to be any additions or any reflection on that definition given where we are today. And I'll just make two observations to start. We did mention three other elements that are important in discussing evangelicalism today and thinking about its theological definition. I'm going to distinguish that in a little bit from something else. The first is the role of the Holy Spirit in the community. We talked a lot about that in the last podcast. We made the point that evangelicalism is a global movement. It's not just a local or regional movement. And just to underscore that a little bit, in 1900, 92% of the evangelical community was located in Europe and North America, and 8% were in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Oceania. Today, those figures are flipped. 77% of evangelicals today are located in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Oceania. And so those numbers have totally changed. This is from statistics compiled by Todd Johnson. So, and shared, they were shared, I think, at the last WEA meeting in Turkey. So that's an important context. And then the last observation I'd make is that evangelicalism is cross-denominational. It's not rooted in a particular denomination. It's rooted across a variety of denominations. In fact, it's that character that might give it some of its dynamic, is the fact that you have people from various backgrounds, all committed to Christ around these central definitions in order to, and working together on kingdom issues that makes evangelicalism, at least theological evangelicalism, what it is. So I want to begin by asking, why is defining evangelicalism, because the title of this podcast is What is Evangelicalism? Why is defining evangelicalism important? And should we distinguish the definition I just went through from any other forms of evangelicalism that people perceive are out there? So that's my opening question. And we have a panel that is assembled literally from around the world. So as you speak and you're a panelist, please feel free to tell us who you are, what you do, and where you're from, where you reside, so that people get a sense of the international nature of the panel. And I'm going to start in the room. We've got a room here of several people. You can see them gathered around the table. I'm going to start in that room by asking the question again. Why is defining evangelicalism important, and why is this discussion important? And I think I see Brian on the one end, and then we have Peirong and we have Sam Chang in the room. So if you guys will start us off, that'd be great.
Okay, Brian Stiller, I serve as Global Ambassador for WEA. I think it's valuable to affirm and bring reminder of the evangelical community globally, because it does have it is distinct within the broader Christian community. If you look at the 2.4 billion, you've got half of those would be Catholic. The World Council, which includes 300 million Orthodox, is about 500 million, and evangelicals in the broadest sense is somewhere between 6 and 650 million. It came to my attention. I was in the upper Nile, and there was a pastor of a church who was being attacked by the Muslim community in his area. When he finally sat down with the imam and told him that he was not a cult, he wasn't a sect, he was part of a global body of a group called Evangelical, 600 million wide. That brought a change of conversation within that community when the Islamic community recognized that this small church in the Upper Nile was part of a global body that was not some kind of cult or sect, as I said, but was part of a mainstream Christian religious community. That made all the difference for them. So there's just one example of us retaining this category, bringing about a fuller definition, and utilizing it as a way of identifying association and core faith.
Peirong?
Hello, I'm Peirong. I'm from Singapore. I'm currently in sunny Dallas. I work with the WEA in the area of operations. Thank you for hosting this interesting podcast. I think what for me is interesting about when you talk about evangelism as a global movement, it shows me two things. It shows me that we are all important. You know, Jesus as the Son of God and the Son of Man puts us as humanity as central. And as a global movement, it is not just one part of the world that is important. We, wherever we are important. And that I think is important for me to remember. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Samuel Chang. I currently live in the United States. I have been a 5-time immigrant, and lived in Asia for many, many different years. When I think about evangelicalism, I bring us back into the word history of the early church and where we were called evangelicals. I think it was in the church history around 80, 140, 150, when Tertullian was looking at how the word evangelion and describing the people and talking about us in light of the heresy that was going on. So I think we have a rich history of which we need to embody and bring forth into this conversation. And for me, it starts with the history part, and as we pull the church forward into the future.
Master, introduce yourself and why is this important?
My name is Master. As I said, you can call me Obi. I'm currently in Nairobi, but I am from Botswana. That's my nation, the nation where I come from. I'm in Nairobi as the headquarters of the Association of Evangelicals in Africa are situated here. To your question, why should we ask ourselves this question? In addition to my colleagues, I think it's important to establish our family, our being family as evangelicals. And like my other colleague has said, in some quarters in our African nations, evangelicals are in minority and persecution is real. When I go around those nations, I remind them that they are part of millions and millions of evangelicals. So in as much as evangelicals are made of different denominations and churches, it is important to understand and to establish our one family, our one church of evangelicals in the globe, in the continent and in the globe. So I think it's important to establish that family, our being family as evangelicals, and to establish common understanding of who we are. I will stop that far.
Okay, Ray, I think I see you. What do you think about this conversation? Why is it important?
Well, hello everyone. My name is Ray. I'm speaking to you from Manila in the Philippines. So good near midnight from part of the board where I am. And this is important because I think we are entering a very exciting twist and turn in the family of God all over the world. And as mentioned by the changing data and statistics, those are not just numbers. Those are people with languages, with culture, with different ways of doing things. And as the church starts to grapple with that change, then we need a good space to find our footing. I mean, in that changing dynamics, and that means us being able to understand how things can be different and how things can be the same still. Well, and and also a grapple with the difficult question of what it means. We always hear the word of we have to have unity in diversity, right? But we also need now to grapple as we enter this new season of re-emerging centers of evangelicalism, especially in the majority world. What does it mean to have diversity in that unity? And I think that's an exciting question, but also it could also be an uncomfortable question. And it's good that we are starting this conversation. Please.
Thank you, Ray. Next, I'm going to go to Craig. Craig, why is this important in your mind?
Thank you, Darrell. So I'm Craig Bartholomew, the director of the Kirby Laing Centre in Cambridge, UK, and we're the co-host of this podcast. So welcome on behalf of the Kirby Laing Centre. Now, I myself am a deeply committed evangelical, and the Kirby Laing Centre is an evangelical organization. But why might this be tremendously important for us here in the UK? Well, I'm going to be a bit provocative at this point, but I think we've got to get these things on the table. Many of my evangelical friends that I most respect here in the UK are no longer comfortable with the label evangelical. And the reason for that is the influence of some parts of American evangelicalism that is being felt strongly in the UK. So something has happened in parts of American evangelicalism, which of course, because it's the superpower, and I love America, just for the record, but this influence has spread, and so I've been surprised the extent to which this has spread into the UK. And a result is that some of our best thinkers and practitioners who are deeply evangelical no longer want to use this word. Now, the question for me is, well, how should we respond to that? And my answer is not reactively, but we should respond by retrieving a constructive, recentered, and healthy evangelicalism. So what I would like to see, and what I'm hoping will emerge out of this, is a recentered evangelicalism that will shed some of these aberrations that have developed in the United States and spread, but not be reactive to them, but cast a really constructive vision. And I'm also very aware that we cannot do this without our brothers and sisters in the majority world. And so we need a global, recentered evangelicalism in which the diversity feeds into the unity. So I think this is a tremendously important discussion.
Thanks, Craig. And you're transitioning to where we're going next, but I'm going to put that, I'm going to hit the save button and come back to it because that's where we're going next. Brian Ashford.
Bruce Ashford.
There.
Sorry, Bruce.
Yeah, Bruce Ashford. I say hello to you from Raleigh, North Carolina. My background is I spent some years in the late 90s and early 2000s in Central Asia, working with emerging church there. And then over the next 15 years or so, across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, working in a supportive role with emerging churches and leaders. I think this discussion is very important. Throughout church history, the task of safeguarding the faith once for all delivered to the saints is often bound up with safeguarding words. It's very important for us to safeguard Christian words, and evangelical is a distinctively Christian word. It's a Bible word. It's a gospel word. And the pattern in history is that heresies and cults and heterodox movements inevitably hijack Christian words and redefine them. And it is our job, I think, not to migrate to a different word, but to safeguard the word that we have. And that's the word evangelical. I think the main problem in the United States is that our media, I don't think they've done this furtively or intentionally, but they have hijacked the word. And it has come to mean anybody in the United States who has any tie to the Christian faith, who opposes progressive politics in its current iteration, which is a horribly inaccurate view of the word evangelical. I mean, it includes Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and people who couldn't articulate Christ's atonement if they had if they were forced to do so, have never had an experience of salvation in Christ Jesus. So I think our job is to safeguard the word, to define what do we mean and how do we identify. So very grateful to be a participant in the discussion today. Thank you for letting me join.
And I can't tell back in the room if Brad Smith is in the room or not, but Brad, are you there? And this will be, I think, the last voice from the panel.
No, Brad is not here.
Okay. That's why I can't see him on the edge of the table. Great. So let's shift gears a little bit. I'm gonna call this thing that Craig raised, the group that is introduced confusion into the name evangelical. I'm gonna distinguish between what I call theological evangelicalism, which is what we've just been defining, and what I would call political evangelicalism, an evangelicalism that's driven more by political concerns and politics, and particularly a kind of nationalism here in the United States from theological evangelicalism. And Craig's hinted at this, but I want to listen to the voices from around the world to talk about what is the impact of that alternative expression of evangelicalism in your part of the world. So just thinking through what this means. Craig says it's exported itself in form to the UK. Is Craig alone, or is that happening elsewhere in the world? Because we don't want Craig to be alone. We want to be able to care for him. So Ray, I'll start with you.
Yeah, maybe the two things that I will need to highlight regard to that question is that there are many voices now in global Christianity, but there are voices that are loud and more influential than the others, and that continues to happen to this very day, even in the advent of social media and the digital technology. I would even say, perhaps even because of what media and technology is able to allow certain voices to be so amplified. Okay? And the other thing is that in many countries who have a colonial history, people would get to develop what anthropologists would call as colonial mentality. Okay? And that means it's the kind of thinking that whatever is coming from the outside would be more better than what we are thinking from the inside or the local. So to address the question very directly, I would say I would agree with Craig because, like, for example, in my side of the world, the voices of churches from the US, for example, because of the close ties that our churches have, the churches from the US, even though people are aware of the theological evangelicalism and like the Bebington Quadrilateral, I mean, people could get swayed very easily, churches, I mean, with the political kind of evangelicalism. And so you will hear issues being debated in the US being echoed as well in the pulpits and in social media forums here in the Philippines. So in the last elections that we have, the political issues that is often became said to be the key political issues from the US are the same political issues that was raised as key for evangelicals to consider in our part of the world, even though we have a very different historical issue that we need to grapple with as a faith community. And that's the kind of impact that political evangelicalism can have, especially if coming from a very influential and powerful country.
And Master, in your part of the world, is there an impact?
I wouldn't deny the impact of the Western culture in the African space. The secular Western culture, for the lack of a better word, allow me to say Western culture, but it's sometimes not necessarily Western culture, but some of the things that are Western are pushed, sometimes through policy of the West into the African space. But I wouldn't say that the extent of the American evangelicalism, the way it has evolved or been divided into political or otherwise, I wouldn't say that has really affected Africa much. The reason being, in our, for example, national alliances, we have constitutions, which in most cases clearly define the stand of the evangelical movement or the national alliance within a nation as apolitical. And so I wouldn't say the American, I don't know whether to say polluted version of evangelicalism has affected Africa that much. And I'm not denying that it is not coming, but it is not pronounced. So we clearly, in our various national spaces, call ourselves evangelicals without being aligned to any political inclination. I would, in conclusion to your question, say I have a reservation in maybe calling that kind of evangelicalism political evangelicalism. Maybe we could say partisan evangelicalism, because evangelicalism should speak into the social space, speak into political space without any fear of being labeled as political. So maybe it's partisan political evangelicalism. Thank you.
Yeah, that's helpful, Master. Appreciate that. Peirong, your part of the world, I know you overlap a little bit with Rei, but go ahead.
So I mentioned I come from Singapore. I live in Germany, and I've lived in Brussels for 6 years before that. So in many ways, I find my thinking of evangelicalism something that is always external to where I am at. You know, I don't feel in many ways very plugged into the environment of the mainstream German evangelicalism movement. I go to a very mainstream church. I'm part of it, but the idea, the questions in German, while I can understand, the nuances are a little lost on me. So what I'm trying to highlight is that as a diaspora, as somebody who has lived outside of a home country for so many years, like it or not, what happens in society has an impact on who people think I am. So that's number one. Number two, I want to think about how we say that political evangelicalism is different from theological evangelicalism. I think a lot of people down the street don't make that differentiation. You know, we think of ourselves as, I love Jesus, I'm a child of God. And how I experience the word is in many ways not pure. It is mediated by the people I talk to and the kind of people who teach me. So if I have Brian who always comes and teach me on what doctrine should look like and a very Canadian perspective of evangelicalism, I would in some way just absorb it and get influenced by it. So I think there is a lot of who are the people who are speaking into the lives of the people around them. And that, I think, brings to me the importance of media. What is media sharing right now, and what are our churches listening to? Thank you.
So I'm going to shift gears a little bit here, because we've raised the media a couple of times, and I'm going to make an observation as a moderator, and that is the media does focus on certain aspects of what evangelicalism is, which obviously impacts the way people see it, particularly people who are not close to the movement. That's definitely going on. But the question is the media also seizing on something that's there? And that the fact that the attention is drawn to the media to certain kinds of evangelicalism, how do we cope with that? In other words, is there a burden on evangelicals? I'll say it traditionally defined, that requires that we do a better job in showing what we perceive evangelicalism to be, as opposed to what tends to get highlighted? Is there anything that can be done about that challenge that is raised because of the way oftentimes evangelicalism gets covered by the media? I'm trying to distinguish here between blaming the media, and I think there's a danger. I'll say it this way. I'll just say it outright, be like Craig and just be controversial. I think there's a way of trying to blame the media in part for where we are. I think it's another thing to take responsibility for where we are as a movement, and that distinction is really, really important and has to be faced up to. That I'm gonna throw that as a curveball to anyone who wants to dive in, although in my soul I know Brian probably wants to get us rolling.
Let me draw the parallel with the Roman Catholics. Over the last number of years, of course, there's been the debacle within the Roman Catholic Church as it relates to Catholic priests and sexual violations. So does a Catholic say we need to change the name of Catholic because within our community we've got this violation, we got this spiritual moral aberration? No, I think what you do is you deal with the critical issue. In response to what you said, Darrell, I think let me just back up a bit on that. For us in WEA, when we go to the UN, in Geneva on human rights, when we go to the Vatican representing who we are, or the World Council, or to a Muslim group or whatever, while they recognize what's going on in the US and the politicization of the word, they don't see that as being affecting who we are or who we represent. And our voice as representing evangelicals, we continue to affirm that and centralize the rationale for why we represent this group of people, and we move forward in doing it, recognizing that when you have the skirmishes on the side, you don't let that deter you or let that redefine you, even as Bruce has helped us to understand that we don't allow the word to be lost simply because within the mix there are these aberrations.
Anybody else? It's open-ended. I'm not going to direct it towards someone.
I'm Bruce, weighing in
different
from
observations.
Jump in.
Two observations very, very quickly. 2 decades ago, I was living in Hong Kong, met up with friends in Europe. And at that time, people who were in the church observed the US evangelicals as somewhat nuts. That's two decades ago. Fast forward 10 more years. I have friends in Europe and also in Asia. You know what they say to me? They say, hey, every morning when I wake up, I can't wait to see what's on television. I said, what time do you really watch the television? They said 8 o'clock in the morning. I said, what's on 8 o'clock in the morning in your city? They said CNN. We get to see what happens as drama coming out of the White House. And they said, we get entertainment first thing in the morning. I said, why are you associating that to evangelicals? He says, because the president in the United States has that political support, and we get to see that, and that became, for me, an understanding of political evangelicalism in the way that we are tracking with media. And so these are aberrations, and yet the culture has shifted in conversation for me from theological evangelicalism that we were talking about, and then also political evangelicalism, because the power of the media has exported many different things, and people who are in the church in and around the world have seen certain things and accepted as face value.
Interesting. Bruce, I know you wanted to chime in.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. This is a great question. So on the one hand, we as evangelicals can't really hold we as evangelicals accountable on any, we don't have the authority structure that, for example, the Catholic Church might have. They have some devices and mechanisms for holding people accountable. So we can't hold people accountable in any sort of organizational manner, because we're a movement of loosely connected organizations, people, and churches. However, there are two things, speaking to Darrell's point. One is we are responsible and should hold ourselves accountable for how we define the word evangelical. There are responsive journalists out there on the left and the right who want to describe voter blocks in the right way and want to use the word evangelical in the right way. And our job is to state clearly what we mean when we use the word evangelical. The second thing is that, unfortunately, in the United States, there is a tendency for many evangelicals to take the conclusions that they draw in the political realm, in which they're engaging in forms of indirect reasoning from Scripture towards some political issue, which is notoriously complicated, right? The Bible doesn't give explicit directions of how to do political things in a 21st century democratic republic. The Bible isn't written for that purpose. So we engage in indirect forms of reasoning. We draw our conclusions. And unfortunately, many evangelicals communicate those conclusions as if they are manifestly, obviously, directly taught by the Bible. And so what the media does is they latch on to our clear confession that Jesus is Lord and that God is 3 in 1. And we also express a political conclusion with the exact same confidence from the Bible. Jesus would clearly vote for option B in the sewage referendum, manifestly, undoubtedly. And so we have to be very careful, I think, when we draw conclusions of drawing them with some humility and distinguishing between the confidence that we have, for example, in truths that we see in the Nicene Creed and truths that we might affirm in the political realm. So we definitely have to police ourselves on that.
To what extent, and I'm trying to monitor the chat while this is going on, which is a little bit of a challenge, but there's an observation in the chat that says something to the effect of, we're not just defined by our doctrine. There is a kind of social evangelicalism or an activism about the way we live out our faith that is performative, where we demonstrate who we are. In asking my question earlier, one of the things that I'm kind of fishing for is the idea of, we hear that evangelicals do certain things, and the media tends to focus on certain things that we do that tend to be in the political realm. But there's a lot of what evangelicalism does and represents itself, especially globally, that doesn't work in that space. It works in a completely different space, in a completely different serving space, in a completely different ministering and compassionate space, if I can say it that way. How good a job do we do of portraying what evangelicalism actually does globally, in contrast to what tends to get highlighted within the media? And does that have the potential to make a difference? And again, that's an open-ended question. I'll let whoever wants to be the fish that wants to bite the bait. I've cast the line into the water.
Darrell, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Craig.
No, go ahead, Craig.
Yeah, I don't know if it helps, but I've been using the raise my hand indication. So
Okay.
I don't know, yeah, but so sometimes that prevents the speaking over one another. So just there are two comments I would make, and I would welcome input from others. I think in global evangelicalism, we need to acknowledge the diversity, as Rei has said, but we need some instruments of our unity. So the problem with evangelicalism is that, you know, almost everyone feels with their Bible, they are the final authority. And it would be great, in my opinion, maybe this is the World Evangelical Alliance, but it would be great if there could be recognized a place from which more or less authoritative documents or whatever about global evangelicalism could emerge. So I think we do need, I mean, Catholicism has clearly got this with encyclicals and so on and so forth. So if people want to know what Catholics think, they know where to go. I don't know where people would go if they want to know what evangelicals think. The second thing I would just say is I think we've got to rethink our whole communication strategy. So somehow, I mean, when I hear the things that move me profoundly are stories like Brian's with the small church in the Upper Nile. Those stories have got to be told and retold. We need 1,000 such stories from all over the world. And somehow we've got to get that into the mainstream media. And that's what I call not a reactive evangelicalism, but a positive, constructive, re-centered evangelicalism.
Well, I'm not seeing any raised hands, but so let me go to Rei.
Darrell.
And see. Yeah, go ahead. Master, is
Yeah.
that Master? Whose voice
Okay.
am I hearing?
It's me, Darrell, but if Master wants to go first, okay.
You can go first. You are already on the mic. You can go first. I will follow.
Okay. Maybe what I would like to say when we ask this kind of questions, that one is which media, where, then when we talk about of we, who is we in the question, and because that to connect with what Craig has said, what we need to untangle is what is often called as the danger of a single story, and people hearing a single story, right? And that would also be true of the evangelical movement as having, or being portrayed as, or being seen as having a single story, and people identifying that single story with one particular church expression in one part of the world. And as one person from our chat box has said, the loudest people will tend to get heard in the media. And the media is also not a neutral tool that we just use. Media was developed somewhere, right? And and media was controlled from somewhere. And so, for example, I mean, why we don't hear about the different kind of story of evangelicalism in Nepal, which is a very young church, but a very vibrant and thriving church. And why doesn't the story of the Nepali church, when churches are coming together regardless of denomination, why is not that the story that we hear about evangelicalism over against what we are trying to problematize here? And I think the reason for that is that we are having a single story of what evangelicalism is, which is, as we've been discussing, not necessarily the case. And we need to ask, when we talk about media, that you need to remember that media media, you can think about this as in terms of there are people who produces media and there are people who consumes media. And who produces media more and who consumes more or tends to consume more? Those with capacity to produce more will be seen more, heard more, and those with the capacity, don't have the capacity, will be the one who are consuming more. Like for example, a very clear example. The kind of textbook we have in Bible seminars and colleges, standard textbook, are the ones that would be coming from one part of the world. And then people will hear in social media that these professors who are writing this kind of textbooks are actually supporting this kind of political, what Master has helpfully said, partisan opposition on certain things. And people would identify, oh, because they are our revered textbooks on theology. So their political outworking of who they are as Christians, as political Christians, must be also the right one. But I like, Darrell, your question, that the other part of your question, what can be done about it, right? You were also asking that. And we are glad that there are certain groups who are intentionally and seriously trying to give platform for other voices from majority world, who are really making an opportunity to produce alternative systematic theologies, alternative theological resources, and even alternative speakers. I mean, give people with important things to say, but they just don't know where to put those voices so that it can be heard by the other part of the world. And we can just pray that those initiatives will grow more and
Master?
more.
My contribution to the last two questions would be the perception of the media and also of those outside evangelical circles about us sometimes has been informed by our way of doing evangelicalism. In my view, we divorced our spirituality as evangelicals from our physicality. And then we then become viewed or perceived as people who are just focused on spiritual and irrelevant when it comes to matters that bread and butter issues. So our activism needs to be broad, beyond just witnessing. With our witnessing needs to be broad, not just Jesus loves you, come to Christ, which is core, but Jesus is broad. He said, if you see me, I mean, the sheep, he will say to the sheep, you saw me naked, you gave me clothes, you saw me hungry, you fed me, I was in prison, you visited me. These pragmatic or physical activities needs to go concurrent with our activism of witnessing, which is evangelism. So, which is winning people to Christ. So in some instances, this pragmatic component of our evangelicalism, was often then divorced from the structure. Then you'll have independent organizations, which are originally from evangelicals or formed by evangelicals, who are now operating in silo, apart from the church, evangelical church. Then the evangelical church is these spiritual people and who are irrelevant or divorced from the physical world. And that creates perception of irrelevance, fundamentalists, people who are good for nothing when it comes to bread and butter issues. So our activism aspect of the quadrants, the four quadrants, needs to be enriched and holistic. In that way, yes, the negative media, even if there are perceptions or stereotypes about evangelicalism from some quarters of the media, will be overshadowed by the activities of the evangelicalism, and as far as activism quadrant is concerned. So I would say maybe in our history of doing evangelicalism, we tended to be dichotomous in as far as spirituality and physicality are concerned. Yet the God of the evangelicalism, or the God of evangelicals, being the God who created the heavens, spiritual, and the earth, the physical, all matter, which all matter to him. And evangelicalism should be cognizant of that and demonstrate that holistic aspect of activism. Thank you.
And back to the room again, Peirong and Sam. And then we're going to shift gears one last time. And then go ahead.
So, and listening to this, I'm thinking about a few things. You talked about taking responsibility. A few days ago, I had a conversation with Tim Adams, who is in this call, about how the WEA and IFES probably has the word evangelical in it, and it's an international organization, and how somehow it becomes our responsibility to think about how do we present and represent evangelicals around the world. So that was something that we were thinking about in terms of a communication project. So I will be very excited and glad to have as many people work with us on this as possible. So I hear you. What I'm trying to say is, yes, I hear you about the need to take responsibility. The second thing I thought about listening to the conversation is the importance of spiritual formation. It's all great to have a conversation about what's good and what's not good. But I think that how do we help our people? How do we help ourselves? How do I help myself to think about life? It's a lot easier to think in diametric terms, yes and no, black and white. And today and yesterday, I was thinking about, how does God think about you overcome evil with good? You do not overcome evil with evil. How do I manage something that is not great? And in Philippians, it talks about whatever is good, whatever is true, whatever is beautiful, think about such things. So how can we, in light of the drama that comes with that word, think about whatever is good, whatever is true, whatever is noble, think about such things, and how that should form my spiritual formation in the way I am an evangelical. So that's what's in my mind right now.
I'm with her about the spiritual formation part. We could come up with the quadrilateral for Babington, quadrilateral. We could do the Anglican triangle. We could do the Wesleyan quadrilateral again. But if there's no interaction with the forming individually, community, and as congregants, then we're just labeling for the sake of labeling. So that formation aspect is critical as part of the conversation, to have activism, to have theological understanding and biblicism. So I'm with her on that very specific conversation topic.
Okay, I've got two hands, I think, from outside the panel, what I'm going to recognize. One is Israel Ortiz, so you go next. And I think Andrew, let me see, I lost it.
Andrew Kirk.
Yeah, Andrew Kirk. So in that order, Israel. You're muted.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Israel Ortiz from Guatemala, and I work for 30 years with the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students, a company student movement in Latin America to proclaim the gospel of the kingdom. And I would like to share two things about the conversation today. One is that in Guatemala, in Central America and rest of Latin America, the evangelical church has grown in numbers, but not in terms of quality of the life. In other words, a nominal or cultural Christianity is growing with a limited impact on the social structures of the country. In Guatemala and the rest of Latin America, the social problem, the political problems, the environment problem that we have is owing to the careless of participation of the evangelicals and the general society. I think there are two reasons in this context I would like to emphasize. One of them is that the entities that represent the evangelicals defend the status quo, far from holding the state accountable. Number two, evangelicals they don't connect the sacred and the secular. There is a divorce between faith and science, faith and politics, faith and art, etc. I think it needs to we need to revise. The evangelical church needs to revise its theological basis to face the problems of society and its challenges. If we start from the kingdom of God as theological framework of the life and mission of the church, the gospel has to do with all the things, be it evangelism, politics, or art. I think this is one of the concern of the IFS in one of the programs and our work in Ezra Center, a biblical institution in Guatemala that provide theological training for pastors and lay people, how we relate the theology and life, politicals and evangelism, because all the things related with the kingdom of God has to do with the whole things in the society. Thank you.
Andrew?
Yes, thank you very much. It just so happens that 2024 is the 50th anniversary of a very, very great Congress on evangelism, the Lausanne Congress. And I want to bring that up as an indication of probably the first attempt that was made to define evangelicalism in the broadest possible sense. If you go back and look at the covenant, the covenant of the Lausanne Congress, whose author was mainly, but not only, Dr. John Stott, covers quite a considerable amount of ground in which evangelicals are probably, in many ways, unique in their beliefs. This was a covenant that was signed by almost everybody who was there, nearly 4,000 people at the time, and has been refined considerably since that time. I'm just wondering to what extent something like the Lausanne Covenant could be updated itself and give a broader definition, using spirituality as there, The relationship with other faiths is there. I mean, there's a whole host of things, as well as Bebbington's quadrilateral with the supremacy of Scripture, the centrality of the cross, and so on. But it goes beyond that. My experience of having lived in Latin America for 12 years, around that time, I was also incidentally at the Lausanne Congress, which was a great privilege to have been invited to go, that when people wanted to work together in Latin America as on an evangelical basis, it was the Lausanne Covenant which united us, was the big thing. So I'm just suggesting that maybe this is a place for us to revisit, as it were, and 50 years would be a very appropriate time to do it. Thank you.
Yeah, we do have the Lausanne global meeting coming up. Might be an opportunity to do that. I think that's an interesting suggestion. I'm gonna shift gears a little bit, and now what I want to spend our remaining time discussing is this constructive evangelicalism, this positive evangelicalism. So working with adjectives tied to the term evangelicalism today. What should that look like? We've had suggestions related to the way in which we engage, the idea that the way in which we serve people is part and parcel of that. I'll make the observation, and someone did it in the chat as well. I'm not sure we have a theology of social engagement and cultural engagement in our thinking expressed explicitly. There's probably a need to develop something along those lines. How do you function as a Christian in a pluralistic environment in which you are in the public space, in which you are one person at a table made up of people coming from a variety of perspectives in terms of thinking about how to do that well? How do you engage? How do you advocate? How do you lose well when you don't win that argument? All those kinds of questions that come up. So let's talk a little bit, and I think we're planning, this is part of a range of podcasts we're going to be doing. I think the next one is going to focus on the question I'm beginning to ask now, which is, what should a positive or a constructive evangelicalism look like? How would it be like or unlike where we are now? And what should we be driving towards that we haven't been driving towards, that we need to be driving towards? That kind of a question. And again, we can use the hands if someone wants to put up their hands, but that's an open question for whoever wants to dive at it first. Although my tendency is to go to the people gathered at the table there, because they're always a good starting point for getting us rolling. So Brian, I think I'll throw that one to you to start off with.
Well, it's interesting when you look at the history of the evangelical movement, WEA in particular, which was founded in 1846 in England. There were some dominating figures, some dominating issues that drew people together from the US, from Canada, from Europe, and from the UK. And of course, it was following the critical parliamentary debate on slavery. It was dealing with child labor and the issues of the persecution under the Ottoman Empire in Eastern Europe. And so right from the very beginning, the coalition of those that came together to form the Evangelical Alliance was around social persecution issues. So at the very heart of our history, dealing with those social issues has been part of us. Now, I think in the 20th century, we got caught in this bifurcation of the social gospel and the spiritual gospel, and we allowed theological liberalism to drive us away from the heart of social encounter, as our brother from Guatemala has reminded us, and as Padilla and Samuel Escobar reminded us so clearly in 1974. So I think at the very heart of who we are has been either an intuitive response to the social agenda issues, or there's been structural response. That has varied from decade to decade, from country to country. But I think we unashamedly embrace the social engagement issue, maybe define it better, find better ways of acting within those spheres. But that's very much at the heart of what evangelicalism has been at least the last 150, 175 years, in my view.
So I think if I'm listening to Brian right, there is an aspect of relevance. How can we be relevant for the 21st century, for young people, for people who have meetings with a wide screen like that? How can I think about exercising or practicing my faith with people who who are AI maybe, or are real people? How does that look like? How do we think about our relationships across the globe in all sorts of different ways? Where does power come in, and how does that work in the way we deal with the fact that we are a global movement, so we do not want to just prioritize one culture, one nation, or one area, but we want to bring together different people, different genders, different all sorts of different things, ages. How do we do that? So I think from my perspective, that is all important to think about when we think about constructivity.
I have multiple layers of thinking, and I just want to say I'm receiving every input, and hopefully by the next podcast, we will have some more things positive to contribute towards this.
Yeah, I think this is a question to pursue, to really kind of sink our teeth into and think through what that should look like. I think the catalyzing of one of the goals of the podcast has been to generate the conversation we're now having, and to push people not to think about, not to be over-focused on just the definition, but what the ethos of pursuing that definition means for the movement, and for reflecting on where we are and where we need to be, and I do think providing a little bit of a contrast to what people think evangelicalism is, even if it's projected by media that seizes on the loudest voices. I'm getting a lot of that in the chat. And provide, Ray talked earlier about a singular story. Maybe there's an additional story or an additional part of the narrative that needs to be highlighted in a way that raises attention. I think I see Gaetan. Is it Gaetan? I may have pronounced the name. Hand up.
Oh, that's always a tough one. It's Gaetan.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm with the World Evangelical Alliance. I'm the permanent representative at the UN in Geneva. I'm right beside the German Parliament, where I often am, and I get asked this question from people who have no clue what evangelicals are. Most people have heard of them and they think they're bad. And here you are. And my take on this is try to make some of the valuable things for us valuable to them, presented in a way that wins them over. So when they asked me, I had a state secretary ask me, what is evangelicalism and what is missions? I really think critically about this. And what I did is I said, well, evangelical is we've taken the decision to follow Jesus, to become like Jesus. I don't get into all the specifics. If they have questions, I'll explain to it. And then I get into missions, and here's where it gets very practical, and I'm trying to make what I think is important valuable to them. And I said, for missions, I see it in 3 layers. I see the first layer is living according to Jesus in a way that's positive. So I gave an example to the state secretary once, saying, well, I had trouble in my life with being hopeful and being full of thankfulness, so I worked on that. And I think I've come a long way. And if you think that I have more hope and thankfulness than anybody on the street outside and here from the ministry, well, I've already missioned you because you felt something from my faith. And she looked at me and says, wow, well, I really feel that you have more hope and thankfulness. I think it's good like that. And then I went to the second point and I said, one of the things that we do as evangelicals, we serve people. We serve the youth, we serve people in humanitarian aid. We're one of the biggest actors in the world on this. And we cannot not serve. It's just part of an intrinsic value from our faith. And I was telling her, we were doing a medical outreach in an Asian country, and people started asking us, why are you coming here and serving us for free? We're at 2,000 meters out in the Himalayas, close to Tibet. And it impressed Buddhists so much that they were asking us, why do we do this? And I said, and here you go. Now we're at the third part. And it's actually the part that's the most critical, some people would say. A lot of people think evangelicals spend most of their time just trying to forcefully convert people. I said, well, what do? We serve the people. We were full of hope, full of thankfulness. And now the people are asking us why we're doing this. And we told them, well, it's because Jesus called us to serve you. So apologetics is not about answering a question that people are not asking. When you live this way, you'll find out, you'll find the opposite. People start asking you questions because they noticed something that was valuable for them. And the state secretary said, wow, now I didn't know this. And so it changed her opinion. And it's very simple. I call it contextualized apologetics. Make what's valuable to us valuable for them, present it in a way. There's a lot of things I didn't say, but it was enough for the first step to have her understand us from a different context, for people who really want to serve people, which is Jesus-like, and of course express what I mean about being Jesus-like, being more hopeful, being full of thankfulness. So it was just examples, but it saved the situation pretty well for somebody in the government of Germany who thought evangelicals are not necessarily good people. And since then, we've been in a good relationship. So I've used this approach several times to try to give evangelicalism an expression, something that's valuable for them too. And it's not something that maybe solves all situations, but when you live, I work in politics, I work in diplomacy, I have a lot of people asking me these same questions, and it's been a good way to open the door in a positive way. So I just thought maybe that would be helpful for this conversation.
It's very, very helpful, and it's along the directions of why I've talked about a positive evangelicalism in some ways. That what people pick up is, what they sense is that if you show you care for people, you create room to have much better conversations. Bruce, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, this is a very good question. Evangelical approach to social engagement. I have one or two just small observations. After Philip Jenkins published his trilogy, the Evangelical Missiological Society's occasional bulletin published an article that was reflecting on the differences between Northern evangelicalism and Southern. And I think there were 7 characteristics given. And one of those characteristics had to do with social engagement. And the observation that was made, that in my experience is an accurate observation, is that in the Northern Hemisphere, in the United States and certain nations in Europe, our social engagement tends to focus on changing the system. On the primary thing we do on behalf of Christ is to reform the political system so that it will more closely reflect what we believe is God's will for society. Whereas in the global South, the primary focus is usually not changing the system. The primary focus is ecclesial witness, personal testimony, so like on the American scene, and I'm not criticizing this, I think we ought to try to change the system when it needs to be changed, but it shouldn't be the primary focus. And it's complicated. I mean, the different American attempts to reform the system almost all marshal God as the primary guarantor and supporter of their project. And God's name gets, tossed around more than a drunken monkey at a biker rally. And I think that sort of thing shouldn't be primary, that I think we should take the lead of the global South and that ecclesial witness should be primary. For example, Wang Yi of Early Rain Church in China was arrested a few years ago. And Yi actually has put together a pretty sophisticated social philosophy, and he's written on it, but in his public statements, it's all ecclesial witness. It's Jesus is Lord and Caesar is not. Things that you can take to the bank that Scripture makes very clear. And so I think there's a broad range of ways that evangelicals globally approach social engagement, but I think we should take our cues from, I think it's fair to say, most of the emerging churches and leaders in the global South, which is that ecclesial witness is primary when it comes to social engagement rather than changing the system politically. Yeah.
So, Bruce, just to follow up for clarity's sake, when you talk about ecclesial witness and personal testimony, you're talking about a smaller level of engagement with people around us as opposed to a structural challenge per se. Is that what you're saying? Ecclesial witness represent how the church is seen by the way in which it engages with its community?
I'm thinking on my feet here. I think what I'm saying is, however it is that we articulate, like, here in the global North, I spent a decent amount of time writing on changes that I think we should make to the system. So I don't think it's wrong to do that. I think we have to find ways of making sure that what people hear from us most loudly and clearly is that Jesus is Lord. Mm-hmm. And that he is building his kingdom, and that's the primary note, that we find ways to make sure that that is the primary thing that we're known for, and that secondarily we might be about changing the system. I think in the global South, a lot of times the reason, it seems, global church leaders, in my experience, they just say, we don't see any human chance of changing the system here, and that shouldn't be our primary focus anyway. Does that make sense?
So you're saying the witness about what the message of the church is. How do you connect that? And one last question, then I'll go to Israel again.
Okay.
How do you connect that to the great commandment? In other words, it seems to me that if we're going to talk about Jesus being Lord and manifesting itself, then the expression of the great commandment, which is, loving God and loving your neighbor, and that's, if underneath the drive to impact people around us, is to express that and have that be seen, to be salt and light, those kinds of ideas.
Yeah, and I just want to tie that to the churches as the primary institution in society rather than the government as the primary institution.
Got it. Okay, that helps. Israel?
Yeah.
You're muted again.
Yes. I think the problem in terms of social commitment is that most churches stick to the first level of the social action, the social assistance. In other words, the effects of poverty are attacked, but not the causes of poverty. We made a research in Guatemala about the thought and social role of evangelicals in Guatemala, and we found that most of the churches are involved in social assistance, but they don't take care about the causes or the structural problems of the society, for the poverty, the violence, malnutrition, corruption, other things like that. Then this is the problem in Latin America. Most of the churches are interested in social responsibility, about provide foods, clothes, something like that, but they do not say nothing about the structural problem that we are facing up in Latin America. Thank you.
Dave, Bookless.
Thank you. This has been a great discussion. I just want to follow on in a sense from what Gaetan was saying, and also Israel, in terms of the fact that part of the problem that we have is the perception that evangelicals are bad news when the gospel is good news. And we need people to understand that the gospel is good news. Generally, that's something that people experience when they see it transforming things in a positive way. So that can be a local church doing small acts of service and ministry. It can also be, and I agree with Israel, that we need the both and of the local ecclesial engagement and the sometimes political advocacy, where we're looking to address the changes, address the causes of the injustices that we see. And that may be changing a political system. It may be campaigning against the way certain companies are behaving and the way that affects ordinary people. So we need the both and, but the fact is we must come over as good news. And if we're simply shouting, you know, this is wrong, you need to stop it to society, then people will take that as bad news. If we're making changes that people experience as positive, if we look back at the very earliest evangelicals, the Clapham sect in the UK, that's exactly what happened there. Transformation in the lives of prisoners, in the lives of prostitutes, in the lives of slaves, in the lives of many, many different groups in society. And those involved both the practical hands-on action at the local level and the political advocacy. And it went hand in hand with the proclamation of the good news of Jesus. And people see that whole package. And I think where evangelicals are good news in the world today, people still see that. And we had the example of Nepal shared earlier. But where we simply seem to be banging on about issues that go against the grain of society and trying to get back to something that we had in the past, we are not seen as good news.
Yeah, Dave, I often talk about the gospel having this tension built within it, the challenge of the presence of sin and fallenness with the invitation to a different way of living. And I say, if all you do is the challenge part and you don't get to the invitation and the alternative and what's being offered, you haven't offered the gospel. You haven't offered the good, you've never got to the good news. You've never shown the good news. You've never displayed the good news. I sometimes say to audiences, sometimes we need to talk less and show more, and let the way in which we engage with people be the positive statement that we make that says that we care for people. Very, very important. I've got time for one more comment, and Ray's hand is up, and then I'm going to try and sum up.
Yeah, maybe I just need to just highlight the fact that when we say Jesus is Lord and we talk of kingdom, we need to be very, very sensitive of the context where that is spoken. In context like the majority world, Jesus would be good news because he is bad news to those who are abusing power, who are perpetuating the kind of structures that keep people at the experience of injustice. So what I'm saying here is that what makes Jesus good news, that he is also bad news. Bad news to all those who cause our world to suffer, and for the weak, the needy, and the poor, and the oppressed to be at the state that wherein they could know that they could not expect any change and they could not see any hope. And so what I'm saying is, somebody mentioned in the chat about a service. When we say that Jesus is King, he is the King who serves. When we say that he has a kingdom that is not of power, but is a kingdom of the powerless. And I think that is what will resonate so much with the rest of the world. And this is not to romanticize the poor or people at the oppressed, but just to say that when Jesus read Luke chapter 4, he definitely is saying that the good news is never neutral. God has a stand, a very clear one.
Thank you, Ray. Well, let me wrap up. Our time is totally disappeared. And I think what you can expect from us next is a podcast that's going to continue this conversation on positive evangelicalism and what a constructive engagement looks like. I think that there's a need for projecting an evangelicalism, to use Dave's picture, that isn't just negative and banging on people, but actually goes in a positive kind of direction. The thankful kind of evangelicalism that Gaetan, and again, I apologize if I mispronounced your name, raised with us. I do think we need to wrestle with a theology of engagement that's expressed in not just in words, but actually in concrete actions that show the care that God has for people, that's represented in what the cross is all about and in the service it's all about. And that's across the board. It's got to be holistic. It can't just be at an individual level. It's got to also be at the level of the challenges of the way in which people take advantage of one another across structures that represent the presence of fallenness in our world, that also need to be addressed and dealt with. I want to thank everybody for participating and being a part of this. And like I say, this is part of a series of podcasts that we hope to continue to bring to catalyze this conversation, to get us thinking about it. Hopefully we can encourage some of you who are leaders of various groups to think about how you can address this to the constituencies that you have in a way that might help us work together and come together in a helpful kind of way. And so as a sign off, I'm going to hang it back to Craig, who's our actual host at the Kirby Laing, and I'll let him make whatever remarks he wants to make to wrap up.
Thank you, Darrell. So just to thank you all, and on behalf of the Kirby Laing Centre and our partner, the World Evangelical Alliance, and thank you all for attending and for the very constructive debate. I think this is important. And then just in terms of the Kirby Laing Centre, so I encourage you to visit our website so you can see who we are. And that's Kirby Laing Centre, and spelt as the British and Canadian spell centre, centre.co.uk. And so there's lots, I think, for us to follow up here. I also want to thank Dr. David Larson, who's the Senior Fellow of the Kirby Laing Centre, Director of our Scripture Collective, and who's responsible really for organizing these events. So thank you all very much, and we wish you God's rich blessing wherever you are in his wonderful world. Thanks very much, and bye for now.
Thank you.